beaten bloody in the church aisle by her own groom. A cowboy stopped the wedding and gave her a vow. The ring hit the floor before I even got to the door. I heard it, that small, hard clink from outside on the boards, through the half-open window, and something in my chest pulled taut like a wire. A man doesn't know sounds like that until he's heard them. A ring on a plank floor means a hand was raised, means something snapped. I was there to water my horse. That's all I was there to do. The church at Ritter's Crossing was the only building in 3 miles that had a trough out front, and I'd ridden since before first light with a horse under me that had given every drop she had. I wasn't invited to any wedding. I didn't know those people. I'd never been through Ritter's Crossing before that morning, and hadn't planned on stopping more than 10 minutes. Then I heard the ring hit the floor. Then I heard the sound after it. Not a scream. I want to be accurate about this because people who weren't there have made it something it wasn't. It wasn't a scream. It was more the sound a person makes when their breath gets knocked out of them and they know better than to make noise about it. A small, compressed nothing. The sound of a woman who has learned not to make a scene. That sound has lived with me for going on 22 years now. Some things do that to a man. My name is Callum Dean. I was 37 years old on that day. I had been a working cowboy since I was 14, first for my uncle's outfit up near the Gallatin, then for a string of other men's ranches across 3 territories. I owned nothing with 4 walls. I had a horse, a saddle, a bedroll, a Winchester, and maybe $9 in coin. I was riding south because I'd been let go from the Harker spread 3 weeks prior, and there was supposed to be work at a place called the Dunbar outfit down toward the Pecos. That's the accounting of it. A man with nothing going somewhere that might have something, stopping to water his horse. But I'll tell you something else. I was also the kind of man who had never in his life walked past a sound like that and kept walking. Not once. Not my father's house, not behind saloons, not on the trail. It had cost me before. A job once. 2 of my back teeth another time. I knew what it cost and I went through that church door anyway because the cost of the other thing, of hearing it and walking on that, was higher. For me. I know it isn't for every man and I'm not standing in judgment of anyone, but for me it was higher. What I saw when I came through that door was the kind of thing you don't want to see at a wedding. She was on her knees between the pews, 2nd row from the front on the left side. Her veil was torn at the shoulder where it attached and half of it had come down across her face, so all I could see was one side of her and the blood starting from her lip and a smear of it on her cheekbone. Her hands were flat on the plank floor like she was trying to decide if she was getting up. He was standing over her. The groom, big man, not tall but wide, the kind of wide that comes from labor and also from pure mean. He still had the ring in his fist, a wedding band. He'd backhanded her with it on his hand mid-ceremony. The preacher was against the back wall. The witnesses, 4 of them, a couple on each side, were frozen where they stood. Nobody had moved. Nobody had done a thing. I don't know how long it had been happening before I came through the door. The preacher had the look of a man who wasn't surprised. That last part is the part that settled it for me, that the preacher wasn't surprised. I came down the aisle. The groom, I'd learn later his name was Varner, Ed Varner, a cattleman with the better part of 400 acres south of town. He looked up at me the way men like that look at things that arrive uninvited, like he was deciding whether to deal with me now or later. I said, "Get away from her." He said, "Who in the hell are you?" I said, "Get away from her." He took 2 steps toward me and that settled the geometry of it. I hit him once, hard, with my right hand, and he sat down on the edge of a pew and looked at me and I could see him calculating. There was blood on his lip by then. He had enough sense to look at my hands and at the Winchester on my back and to do the arithmetic. He said, "You have no idea what you've walked into." I said, "I don't need to." He sat there a few more seconds. Then he stood up and straightened his coat and walked out of that church like I wasn't worth his time, like he was choosing to leave. I've seen that move before. It's what a man does when he knows he'll be back with more cards in his hand. I turned around. She had got to her feet by then. She was holding the edge of the pew with one hand, and she'd pulled the veil back from her face with the other. The blood on her lip was still fresh. She was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. It wasn't gratitude, and it wasn't fear, and it wasn't quite anger. It was the look of a person who has had things decided for them so many times that they've stopped trusting anyone who shows up and makes a decision. I said, "Is there somewhere you can go?" She didn't answer right away. The preacher had moved to the side door and gone through it, which told me a great deal about the preacher. The witnesses were shuffling toward the back. The church was emptying out like smoke from a room. She said no. One word, just that, like it was the plainest fact she knew. I said, all right. Her name was Nora Bain. She'd been born 26 miles north of Ritter's Crossing, and she'd grown up on a homestead that her father had broken himself on for 15 years before the drought, and the debt finished what the work had started. He died when she was 17. Her mother had died 3 years before that. She'd been keeping herself alive since then by taking in sewing from the women in town and cooking for the boarding house on the south end of Ritter's Crossing 3 mornings a week. She'd taken up with Ed Varner because Ed Varner had asked her to, and because there had been no other reasonable offer, and because she'd been 23 years old and tired of being cold. I learned all of this slowly over days and then weeks, not in a rush of telling. Nora Bain was not a woman who told things in a rush. She measured it out. She'd say something plain and then be quiet for a while, and then maybe add one more thing and then be quiet again. I came to understand that this was how she'd survived, by holding most of herself back until she knew what she was dealing with. She told me herself later on that she'd spent the first 4 days watching my hands. We left Ritter's Crossing that same morning. I didn't have a plan. I had $9 and a horse and a rifle and a direction, and I knew that Varner had land and men and roots in that valley, and staying was not going to go well. She had a canvas bag with 2 dresses and a hairbrush and a small tin box that held a photograph of her parents and $11 of her own money. She tied it to the back of my saddle and climbed up behind me, and we rode south. She didn't thank me, not that day. I didn't expect her to. About 6 miles south of town, on a flat stretch of road with the mountains to the west going gray in the afternoon light, she said, I should tell you that Ed isn't going to leave this. I said, I figured. She said, he has men. I said, I know the type. She was quiet for a moment. Then, why did you come through that door? I said, I heard the ring hit the floor. She didn't say anything else for a long time. I could feel her behind me, the slight weight of her hands on my sides, the stillness that was just her thinking, not leaning on me, just there. That was when I started to understand something about her that I hadn't fully gotten yet. She wasn't fragile. She'd never been fragile. She'd taken everything that life had handed her. The early losses, the cold years alone, the bad choice that turned worse at the altar. And she was still on her feet, or getting back to them, and she wasn't looking for someone to carry her. She was looking for someone who wouldn't knock her down. That was the whole of it. That was all she needed. And I thought, I can do that. Even with nothing else to recommend me, I can do that. I want to tell you about the Dunbar place, because it matters to what came after. We came to it after 2 days riding, across a stretch of country that ran from Red Rock Flats down into a pine bottom valley with a creek running through it, and a set of buildings that had the look of something built by a man who meant it to last. The main house was log and stone. The barn was big enough to winter 30 head. The owner, Dunbar himself, a Scotsman named Arlen Dunbar, who was 60-something and had been on this land since before the war, came out of the barn and looked at me, and then at Nora, and then back at me. He said, Dean. I said, Mr. Dunbar, I heard you needed a hand. He looked at Nora again. I said, she's with me. He said, I don't have a spare room. I said, we'll manage. He looked at me for another 5 seconds, one of those old rancher looks that adds up everything at once. Then he said, $3 a week and found. You start in the morning, and he went back into the barn. We managed. She took over the cookhouse by the end of the first week because the Mexican cook had hurt his back and Dunbar was eating cold biscuits and going to bed angry. Nora could cook the way some women can, not fancy, not showing off, just solid and reliable and good. The kind of food that made men work harder because they had something to look forward to. Dunbar paid her for it, $1 a week on top of my wages, and she took it with no comment, as though she'd expected to earn her keep and wouldn't have had it any other way. I worked cattle, I rode fence. I did the kind of work I'd done my whole life, but there was something different about it now, a quality of intention that I hadn't had in a long time. Before, I was just moving, one outfit to the next. This was the first time in years I had something to come back to at the end of the day, even if what I was coming back to was a small room in a bunkhouse addition that barely fit 2 cots. At night she sewed by lamplight and I oiled tack or sharpened tools or just sat. We didn't talk much, not at first. Didn't need to. There was a quality of ease to it that surprised me. I'd spent so much of my adult life alone that I'd half convinced myself I wasn't built for company. Turns out I was built for it fine, just not for most kinds of company. She caught me watching her once, about 3 weeks in the lamplight, her head bent over some mending, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. I looked away. She said without looking up, "You don't have to look away." I said, "Didn't know I was so obvious." She said, "You're not, I just pay attention." I didn't say anything else, but I stopped looking away. Varner came in October. I'd been expecting him. A man like that doesn't let go of a humiliation, not in front of witnesses, not in his own town. He had too much at stake. Not her, particularly. I don't think he'd wanted her in any deep sense, but the fact of being walked out of his own wedding by a stranger with $9 and a saddlebag. That was the wound. That was what he was writing to close. He came with 2 men, which told me he'd thought about it and decided 3 would be enough. He was wrong. I want to be straightforward about this part. I'm not a violent man by nature, and I want to make that clear because what happened wasn't out of temper or pride. I'd seen it coming. I'd had 6 weeks to think about it. I knew the terrain around Dunbar's property the way I knew my own hands by then, every draw and ridge and approach, because I'd spent those 6 weeks making sure I knew it. That's what a man does when he knows a problem is coming and he takes it seriously. They came through the lower gate at dusk, 3 horses, and I was already in the barn loft with the Winchester. I didn't fire first. I want that on record, too. I called down to them and identified myself and told them to state their business, and Varner told me his business was taking back what was his. I told him there was nothing on this property that was his. He told me I was a dead man. What happened next took about 2 minutes, and I won't dress it up. One of his men took a rifle ball through the meat of his thigh when he went for his gun, and that ended his interest in the proceedings. The other one had better sense and sat his horse without moving. Varner himself had ridden toward the barn door, and I came down the ladder and met him outside, just the 2 of us, and we settled it on the ground. I was 43 and 6 when it was done. He was bleeding from his nose and one ear, and he was on his knees in the yard, and I was standing over him, and I was breathing hard, but I was standing. I said, "You come back and I'll put you in the ground. You know I mean it." He knew. Some men you have to kill, and some men you just have to show you're willing to. Varner was the second kind. He rode out. His men rode with him. I watched them go to the end of the lane. When I turned around, Nora was standing in the door of the cookhouse. She'd seen the whole thing. She was holding a lantern, and the light was behind her, and she was very still. I was bleeding from a cut over my eye where one of his rings had caught me, and my knuckles were swelling, and I was breathing through my mouth. She came down from the step and crossed the yard to me. She didn't run. She walked, the way she did everything, with that deliberate steadiness. She stopped in front of me and lifted the lantern and looked at my face. Just looked at it for a moment with those dark eyes, and then she reached up with her free hand and touched the cut over my eye gently with 2 fingers. She said, "Come inside." She cleaned the cut and wrapped my hand, and she didn't make it dramatic. She just did it, careful and sure, and I sat on the edge of the table and let her. When she was done, she didn't move away right off. She stood in front of me, her hands still holding mine, and she said, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "I know." She said, "You keep doing things you don't have to." I said, "I don't know another way to be." She looked at me for a long moment, long enough that I had to look back. And there was something in her face that was different from anything I'd seen there before, not the measuring look, not the careful watchfulness. Something open, something that had decided. She said, "I know you don't." She said it like it was the whole answer, like it was everything she'd been figuring out for 6 weeks and had finally landed on. She was still holding my hand. The winter came hard and early that year, the kind of winter that kills weak cattle and weak arrangements between people both. By December, we'd moved the second cot out of our room because it had gotten foolish having it there. Nobody in the outfit said anything about it. Dunbar, if he noticed, kept it to himself. The men treated her with the particular respect that frontier men show to a good woman who runs a cookhouse well and doesn't ask for theater. Which is to say, they said please and thank you and kept their mouths clean and would have gone to some trouble if anyone had shown her disrespect. Nobody did. There was a deputy sheriff who came out from the county seat in January. Someone had made a complaint. I figured I knew who, and he talked to me and to Dunbar and to Nora. He was a decent man, this deputy. He looked at the situation honestly. He asked Nora if she was there under any kind of duress, and she looked at him as though the question were slightly strange and said no, she was there because she chose to be. He asked me a few questions about the incident in October, and I answered them straight. He wrote some things down and said he might be back and rode off, and we never saw him again. I believe Varner dropped it. I believe the arithmetic came out wrong for him when he added up a deputy who wasn't friendly to him, a Scotsman who owned 400 acres and had been in the territory since before Varner's father, and a cowboy with nothing to lose and a demonstrated willingness to be unpleasant about it. Some fights aren't worth it. He found another woman to marry the following spring, I heard later. Good luck to her, I thought, and meant it. In March, when the thaw started, Dunbar called me into the house. He was sitting at his desk with papers on it, and he had that look men get when they've thought something through and are ready to say it. He was 63 years old and had no sons and one daughter who'd married a man in St. Louis and had no interest in coming back to the frontier. He said, "I've been thinking about the East pasture." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "It needs its own management. It's been let go. A man with the right sense could build something on that ground in a few years." I said, "It's good ground." He said, "I'd want a share of the increase, a third first 5 years." I looked at him. He said, "I'm not getting younger, Dean. I need men on this land who are building something, not just passing through." I said, "I'd have to talk to Nora." He said, "I'd expect nothing less." I talked to Nora that evening after supper, out by the fence where we went sometimes when the weather allowed, just to stand and look at the country. The sky was doing what it does in March, going from purple to black fast, with a thin line of cold orange along the mountains. I told her what Dunbar had said. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Do you want it?" I said, "I think I do." She said, "Then say yes." I said, "It'd mean staying." She turned and looked at me, just looked. And she smiled. She had a rare smile, Nora, which meant that when it came it was worth something, and she said, "Callum, I am already staying." I didn't say anything. My throat was doing something it doesn't usually do. She reached over and took my hand, just took it like it was the most ordinary thing, and we stood there in the cold looking at the mountains going dark. That was the moment. That was the one. Not the church, not the fight in the yard, not any of the words we'd said. Just her hand in mine and the mountains and her saying it like it was settled, like it had been settled for a while, and I was the last one to know. We married in April, down by the creek on Dunbar's land, in the early afternoon when the cottonwoods were just coming green. The preacher who came out was a different man from the one at Ritter's Crossing, a circuit rider named Henry Poole, who had married 30 or 40 couples across the territory, and did it without ceremony or performance, just the words and the meaning behind them. When he got to the vows, he looked at me and said, "Do you, Callum Dean, take this woman as your wife to honor and protect and provide for?" I said, "I do." And I meant all three, every word of that. She said her part and she meant it too. I could tell from how she said it, not rushed, not performing, just saying it the same way she did everything, plain and sure and with her whole intention behind it. I put the ring on her finger, different ring from the one that had hit the floor of that church in Ritter's Crossing. This one was plain gold, no ornament, and I'd had a man in town size it for me the week before. When it was on her finger, she looked at it for a moment and then up at me, and the look she gave me then is the one I've been carrying ever since. There were 6 people at that wedding, Dunbar and 2 of his hands, the preacher and us. That's all we wanted. I'm telling this from 22 years out, so I can tell you how it landed. We worked that east pasture. First year was hard, cattle prices soft, late snow in May that killed 20 calves we'd counted on. Second year better. By the 5th year we'd bought out Dunbar's share and started buying up the sections to the east. He was glad to see it. He was an old man by then, slower, and he lived in the main house and ate at our table 3 nights a week and seemed content. He died in the winter of our 7th year on the place, quietly in his sleep, and left us the deed to the main house and the north pastures in his will. Nobody challenged it. We'd earned it. We had 2 boys. The first came in the 2nd year of the east pasture arrangement and the second 2 years after him. They're men now, both of them, working the land they were born on. They know the whole of it, where their mother came from, what happened in that church, how we ended up here. I told it to them plain both times when they were old enough. I didn't make it a heroic story. It wasn't one. I was a man with $9 who heard a sound and went through a door. That's the whole of it. They asked me once, my oldest, why I went through the door. I told him the same thing I'd told her. I heard the ring hit the floor. He thought about that for a while, and then he nodded, and I could see him filing it away somewhere, and that was good. Some things a man ought to carry. Nora, I want to talk about Nora specifically, because she's the thing worth talking about in this story, and I've been circling around her long enough. She is 60 years old now, and the country has not been soft to her. It isn't soft to anyone who works it honestly, and she is still the most capable, squared-away person I have ever known. She runs the household and the books, and the supply orders with the same deliberate steadiness she's had since she was standing in that church bleeding with her hands on the pew. She has an opinion about everything, and she shares it when it's useful and keeps it to herself when it isn't. And when she's wrong, she says so without making theater of it. And when I'm wrong, she tells me without cruelty. She has never once, in 22 years, made me feel small. You would not think that would be such a remarkable thing in a marriage. But I had known enough of the other kind, had watched enough men ground down over years by a particular kind of persistent diminishment, that I understood early on what a gift it was, what a specific and deliberate act of generosity it was, to live with someone who saw what you were and said so plainly. She saw me, not what she needed me to be or what was convenient or what made her story easier. She saw what was actually there, and she decided it was enough, and she chose it. She still does every day. There's a moment in the evenings when the work is done and the boys have gone to their own houses and the yard is quiet when we sit on the porch. There's nothing scenic about it. It's a working ranch and it smells like one. The mountains are there in the distance like they always are. She's usually got something in her hands, mending or a letter she's reading or sometimes just a cup of coffee. And I'm usually looking at the land, running through what needs doing tomorrow, the way a man does. And she'll say something ordinary, something about one of the boys or a fence that needs looking at or what came in the mail. And I'll answer. And that'll be it, just that small back and forth, both of us sitting in the fact of our life together. Some evenings I look at her in the lamplight coming through the window, her head bent over something, the gray in her dark hair now, the lines at the corners of her eyes, and I think about that morning in Ritter's crossing with $9 in my pocket going nowhere in particular. I think, look where you ended up. I think, look who is sitting next to you. She looked up once and caught me. The way she had that first time, 3 weeks into the Dunbar outfit, me watching her in the lamplight. She'd said then that I didn't have to look away. She didn't say anything this time. She just held my eyes for a moment with that clear, direct look of hers, and then she went back to what she was doing. Some things don't need saying. Outside the window, the mountains are going dark. The land is ours. I am exactly where I ought to be.